Hello again. This is the second session of the course, The Law of Philosophical Aspects. Now, as you may recall, in the previous session, what we've discussed is the moral duty to obey the law, which was one kind of a topic in which moral questions or questions in moral philosophy intersect with questions about the law. Today's session is going to be similar in one respect, but different in others. We're again going to be discussing a question or a set of questions in which moral philosophy and legal theory intersect. So in that respect, it's going to be a nice continuation of the previous theme. However, it's going to be different in that the question that we're interested in today has interest even independently of the law altogether. So last time the question was about the moral duty to obey the law. It was about the law. The question today, which we will be discussing, the question about moral luck and about legal luck, is at least partly independent of the law. And so it's of interest in moral philosophy, even if you are not interested in the law at all. But it also has interesting implications to the law, which we will be discussing as well in the later parts of the session. So our interest here will be multifaceted. One thing we'll be interested in is the clean, so to speak, the clean moral philosophy question, independently of the law. It is of independent interest, and so we'll be discussing it for the first parts of the session. But then we will also be interested in relevant implications to the legal case, and that will consist of mostly the second half of the session. And also, and this will be just a final slide, if we're lucky, there are also going to be implications going in the opposite direction. So perhaps thinking about the law in relation to luck is going to help enrich the cleaner moral philosophy discussion of moral luck. Or anyway, that's a nice hope to have when we begin. So this topic is, I think, best introduced with the help of some examples. And so let's start with some examples. So suppose that there are two negligent drivers. Both of them say don't drive as carefully as they ought. But one of them actually hits a pedestrian and the other does not. This is not because of some difference in the degree to which they're negligent. It's just because maybe a pedestrian jumps in front of one car but not the other, or something along these lines. Now, of course, both acted wrongly because you shouldn't be driving negligently. And quite plausibly, both are blameworthy for having acted wrongly in this way. But our question is a little bit different. The question is, are they equally blameworthy or differentially so? And you may be drawn in two opposite directions here. Because on the one hand, to the extent that things here are under their control, there doesn't seem to be a difference between them. Both acted negligently to the same degree in the same circumstances. And that sort of pulls rather strongly in the direction of declaring them both equally blameworthy for their negligence. On the other hand, one of them actually hit someone, maybe killed a pedestrian or something along these lines. And you may think, surely that's a huge difference for wrongness and for blameworthiness. If that's not enough by way of a difference, one killed someone, one did not, what more by way of difference can you possibly want here? So these are the intuitions pulling in opposite directions here. Now, this was a case of negligence, but we can just as easily describe cases where what does the work is not negligence but bad intention. So we will be discussing in some detail later on the case of, say, a murderer compared to an attempted murderer when all other things are equal. Now, there are questions here, of course, about the criminal law, and we will get to them later on. But for now, even independently of the law, the question is, are the murderer and the attempted murderer equally blameworthy? And once again, you must feel the intuitions pulling in opposite directions. On the one hand, as far as things are under their control, they are exactly alike. On the other hand, one killed a person, one did not. Surely that makes for a difference. These were bad cases. Here's a good case, or anyway what you may think of as a relatively better case, because it's about praiseworthiness rather than about blameworthiness. So you may think about two people, two heroes, who are attempting, perhaps at a risk to themselves, to save a drowning child. Except one of them succeeds and one does not due to factors that are under their control. It's not that one of them tried harder, but I don't know, the current in the water will behave differently or something along these lines. And once again, we can ask the question about comparative praiseworthiness. Presumably they're both praiseworthy, but to what extent? And in particular, are they equally praiseworthy? Because as far as things are under their control, they behaved in exactly the same way. Or are they differentially praiseworthy because, after all, one of them saved a person and the other did not? So for obvious reasons, these kinds of cases are called in the literature cases of moral luck in consequences. And we'll get back to them a little later on. Here's a different kind of case. Suppose that there are two judges, and so suppose that they are both equally potentially corrupt in the following sense. If someone offers them a bribe in the right kind of circumstances, when no one can catch them and so on, they are both equally strongly disposed to take the bribe. So they are both dispositionally or potentially corrupt. But suppose further that one of them is actually offered a bribe and proceeds to take the bribe, and the other just never gets the offer. So she would still take the bribe had it been offered her, but she never does. Now, of course, both of them fall short, I would say far short, of the ideal for a judge. That seems true. But to what extent? Are they blameworthy, and in particular, are they equally blameworthy? And surely you feel that there's something pulling in opposite directions here, somewhat analogously to the previous case. So on the one hand, both were perfectly willing to take a bribe. The fact that sort of saved one of the judges from being actually corrupt, the fact that no one ever offered her a bribe, is not under her control. It's just a matter of luck as far as she's concerned. She would have taken the bribe had it been offered her. So it doesn't seem she should get any credit for that. And in that respect, it seems that the two are alike. On the other hand, one of them took a bribe and one did not. Surely that must count for something, and it does seem to count for something by way of blameworthiness as well. These are the intuitions pulling in opposite directions here. And we can think of many, many other cases of this kind of phenomenon, many other cases where moral status seems to depend on which situations we find ourselves in, regardless of our own control. So here are two other cases from the literature. So you can think about two German children who grow up in, I don't know, late 1920s Germany. And then one of them with his parents, or with one of his parents if they're twins, as in the example. One of them immigrates to Canada, the other stays in Germany. The one who stays in Germany proceeds to do horrible things, as many people do when under a horrible regime. And presumably, at least to an extent, he's blameworthy for those actions. The one who immigrated to Canada proceeds to live a peaceful life, never doing anything remotely as bad. And here you may think that one of them acted horribly, the other did not, but would have acted horribly had he not immigrated, or had his parents did not decide to immigrate, or something along these lines. And once again, we can ask whether we want to blame them equally. It's not even clear if we're going to blame the German child who immigrated to Canada, or the judge who never took a bribe. If you're going to blame them, it's not even clear what you're going to be blaming them for. Still, it seems like the fact that you're not going to blame them, or not going to blame them as much, is merely a function of luck. And that's how we are here in this problem again. Or here's another kind of case, again on the positive side. So assume two potential heroes. These are two people who are equally willing to sacrifice themselves or to accept a risk for themselves in order to save other people. And both of them go separately on their morning runs, each on their own beach. And one of them sees a child drowning and proceeds to carry his potential heroism into actuality. And he jumps into the water and saves, perhaps at the risk himself, saves the child. So of course, he's praiseworthy, that's very clear. Now the other potential hero just never sees a child drowning on her beach. So she remains merely a potential hero. Another question is, well, should we praise her? Perhaps we should, for even having the disposition. But should we praise her to the same extent that we praise the actual hero? Well, it seems very clear that we don't, but that doesn't settle it, does it? Should we? And if you believe that moral status should not depend in any way on matters that are not under the relevant person's control, then you should say yes. Then in that case, you don't believe in moral luck. But if you believe that we should praise them differentially, then you believe in moral luck. And in particular, the kind of moral luck you believe in is what's called in the literature moral luck in circumstances, namely in the morally relevant situations in which we find ourselves, and the fact that we find ourselves in those situations is not under our control. Third kind of case, that's going to be the last one for now. So suppose that two people come across someone who is badly in need of help, like maybe a hungry homeless person who needs some money to buy food. Now suppose that one of these two people is quite naturally kind and generous. This is not something that she has worked on. This is not an achievement of hers. It's just a morally relevant disposition of character that she finds herself with. And she proceeds to give to the homeless person some money. Now suppose that the other person is actually not naturally generous and not naturally kind, and again, but assume that this is not because of the awful ways in which he behaved in the past. He's just, we find ourselves with all sorts of properties and qualities and dispositions, and this guy is not very generous or kind naturally. So he doesn't give. However, he would have given had he been naturally generous and kind. And recall that the fact that the character trait, the character traits that these people find themselves with, that's, or so we're assuming, not under their control. They're just things they find themselves with. Well, then how do we compare the two in terms of perhaps blameworthiness or praiseworthiness in this case? And once again, or anyway, arguably, once again, you should feel the intuitions pulling in opposite directions. So in one direction, what you get is the feeling that the character trait that you find yourself with is a kind of a lottery. It's not something that you are entitled to be proud of. It's something that you find yourself with, like maybe the length of your nose, something along these lines. And in that respect, it doesn't seem like praiseworthiness should vary along with that. On the other hand, and here it becomes barely intelligible, the thought that there is no moral luck, because what do you mean you would have given had you been generous and kind? That doesn't seem like a strong defense claim when you are accused of not being sufficiently generous and kind. Still, it seems like in these cases, moral evaluation, moral status is at least partly a function of luck, of factors that are not under your control. The factors that are relevant here are character traits, and when these are the relevant factors, we call such cases cases of constitutive moral luck. Okay, so these are the three examples of purported moral luck in consequences, namely where your moral status seem to depend at least partly on consequences that are not entirely under your control. Cases of moral luck in circumstances, namely cases where your moral status seems to depend at least partly on the circumstances in which you find yourself, regardless of whether you find yourself in those circumstances because of your control. And cases of moral luck, of constitutive moral luck, namely cases in which your moral status seems to depend on character traits you find yourself with, also not under your control. And as you can see, the main question when we're talking about moral luck is whether moral luck exists, namely whether it's ever the case that your moral status depends on factors that are not under your control. And we have these clashing intuitions. The entire debate about moral luck can be plausibly and helpfully seen as the attempt to reconcile these clashing intuitions. The intuition on one side is sometimes called the control condition for moral responsibility. Here's one rough sketch of that condition. It's not the only one, obviously. The thought is roughly that we can only be morally responsible for what is under our control. Now, as we will see, there are going to be different versions of the control condition doing work here. Perhaps the more helpful one is the comparative one. And the comparative condition says something like, if two people are exactly alike in what is under their control, then they are also alike in how blameworthy or how praiseworthy they are. And I think it's hard to deny that there is something very intuitively powerful about at least some versions of the control condition on moral responsibility. So this is one side. The other side are the intuitions in the cases that we described, in cases of moral luck in consequences and circumstances and constitutive luck, where we do seem to assign blameworthiness, praiseworthiness, responsibility based on factors that are not under the person's control. And so this is the challenge. Is there moral luck? And in particular, what can we do with the control condition on moral responsibility, which seems very basic to our very thought about moral responsibility on the one side, and the intuitions and perhaps also practices relying on them that somehow moral status is sensitive to luck nonetheless. Okay, then how do we proceed? The question was presented in a couple of papers in the 70s by two philosophers, Tom Nagel, that's his picture right there, and Bernard Williams, whose picture we'll see, I think, on the next slide. That's the problem of the clashing intuitions. And now you may be worried. You may think, well, are we stuck then? There are intuitions pulling in one direction, then there are intuitions pulling in the other direction, and then it's not clear how to proceed. But rest assured, it's going to be okay. There's stuff we can do. And it's not actually that unique. In philosophy, very often, cases in which strong intuitions clash on both sides of a debate are not really a reason for despair. They are the indication of a deep philosophical problem. Or some will say, perhaps sometimes, they are the indication of a deep philosophical confusion, at least on one side. But still, that will itself be interesting philosophical progress to diagnose a deep confusion for what it is. So what we need now are arguments, or anyway, perhaps somewhat more broadly, all sorts of argumentative moves that can carry us forward in this debate. And this is what we will be doing in the next few slides. So one kind of argumentative move, perhaps like the best kind, would be to offer a direct argument for a relevant conclusion. Perhaps, for instance, you have a direct argument against the control condition on moral responsibility. Perhaps you want to refute that condition. If so, we will settle the debate. There is moral luck. Moral status depend on factors that are not under our control, and that's it. Much more plausibly, perhaps you can put forward an argument not necessarily against the control condition, but against some versions thereof, and so we're going to need distinctions. So this is one way of proceeding, offering positive arguments for or against moral luck. Somewhat less directly, but sometimes just as helpfully, you can offer what is sometimes called debunking explanations of intuitions. So we're going to return to these shortly, but for now, perhaps we can explain why people have the moral luck intuitions in a way that doesn't show those intuitions in a positive light, epistemically speaking. Perhaps we can explain why people would have those intuitions even if they were misleading. That would take away at least some of their force as reasons to believe in moral luck. And of course, this is philosophy. So we're going to be doing a lot of distinctions and precisification of relevant intuitions, and we will see that actually this work can sometimes pay off. So let's go ahead and present these argumentative moves. So here's one line of thought, one argument that's associated, or that was first presented by Bernard Williams, that's his picture there, in one of the two papers that I already mentioned that started the debate. The two papers are called, by the way, just Moral Luck. So here's the intuition, and I think what's nice about this argument is that it does capture a very deep and important intuition. We'll see that it's clearer that it captures an important intuition than it is what exactly the argument is and whether it works. But let's start. So think about the horrible scenario in which you, as a driver, hit someone and maybe kill a child. How would you feel? But perhaps more importantly for now, how should you feel? Right? Now, we want to hold the question as clean as we can from other factors. So we're going to assume that there was no fault in driving. And as we know, driving is a percentage business. Even when you drive according to all of the rules and quite carefully, it's still possible for you to hit someone and cause serious harm. So that's the case we're assuming. And the question now is, how would you feel and how should you feel? We also want to set aside, at least to the extent possible, the general sorrow that you would feel for the loss of the child. Of course you would. But then again, that's something that everyone can and probably should feel. So someone, a mere bystander, who is not involved in any way in the accident, should also feel sorrow for the loss. So of course you should feel sorrow for the loss. But it seems like you should feel something extra, perhaps because it was your action, because it was your agency that was involved here. Now, the discussion here is partly psychological, as we sometimes say. It's partly phenomenological. It's partly about what it feels like from the inside to be in that situation. And when you do the phenomenology, I think it's clear that it's not obvious that you're going to be feeling guilt exactly. After all, you know that you have been driving faultlessly. On the other hand, it's not mere sorrow or mere regret, which bystanders can also feel. It's something special that's partly a function of the fact that it was your agency. The fact that you were driving the car seems to make a difference. And so, for lack of a better term, Williams coins a term and he calls it agent regret. Something like in between guilt and mere regret. Something along these lines. It seems clear to me that we would feel agent regret. Or anyway, most of us would. But also it seems clear that we ought to. So what would you think about someone who, having driven the car and hit the child, wouldn't feel anything other than what a decent bystander would feel? It seems like we would criticize them for missing something important. After all, you were doing the driving. Of course, if they proceeded to ruin their lives over it and we were their friends, we would routinely mention and remind them that they were driving faultlessly, that it could have happened to everyone. That's also true. You can exaggerate in both directions here. But it does seem like something like agent regret is not merely a psychological fact, but it's also called for. It's appropriate in the circumstances. Okay, then, how do we get from interesting observations about agent regret to anything at all about moral luck? Unfortunately, Williams is not clear in presenting an argument here, but here's my suggestion. So agent regret, as I've just emphasized, is not just common, but also sometimes justified. That's going to be our first premise. The second premise is going to be that if agent regret is justified, well, what could possibly justify it? It seems like what could justify it is if you were responsible morally, at least partly, for the consequences, even though the consequences are not entirely under your control. And then from these two premises, we seem to be able to draw the conclusion that people are sometimes responsible for things that lie outside their control, like the consequences of their action. If so, there is moral luck, and the control condition on moral responsibility is false. So that's the argument. And I will criticize it in just a really short while, but the important thing about it is to see that there is something going really deep here. So if you fail, this is often true in philosophy, even if you're going to refute the argument, if you fail to see its serious attractiveness, you are missing something important. And I think that Williams has a deep and important insight here. But whether the insight can carry the weight of the argument, in particular the conclusion, is different. And in fact, I want to offer the following criticism. The argument is valid, right? So the conclusion does follow from the premises. So the question now is whether the premises are true. And none of the premises here is obviously true or anything like obviously true. As I suggested already, I want to grant premise one. So I want to grant the fact that agent regret is sometimes justified. But I want to question premise two. And in particular, I want to raise the following worry. And the worry is about the fallacy of equivocation. So equivocation is the kind of fallacy that happens when we use the same term in two premises in an argument, and so so that the argument looks valid. But in fact, we use the term in somewhat different meanings in the two premises. And so the argument only looks valid, but in fact, it is invalid. It equivocates on the relevant term. So here's my worry. The worry is whether the term agent regret is used in precisely the same way in the two premises. In the first, now we don't have a good definition for it, right? It's not like a term that we've been using all along. We have a rough phenomenological characterization of it, which is okay as far as it goes, but it still raises the suspicion that we may need more in order to determine whether the argument is valid or not. And here's the worry. The worry is about the link to responsibility. So it seems like the second premise assumes that agent regret is related to responsibility. But the first premise may assume the negation of this claim, because we were assuming that in the case of the driver, the faultless driver, who nevertheless hits a pedestrian, we were assuming that they were not morally at fault, they were not perhaps morally blameworthy. Premise 2 says that they are. But if premise 2 says that they are, and in fact, if that's how we understand agent regret as the kind of feeling that entails that, then I take back my commitment to premise 1. Then it's, well, in that sense of agent regret, I don't think agent regret is justified. At least not when full guilt is not justified, namely when I haven't acted faultlessly. So the challenge is to come up with an argument that doesn't equivocate on agent regret. Perhaps we need a more precise understanding of agent regret for that. An argument that gives us a reason to believe that there is moral luck, that people are responsible for uncontrolled consequences of their action, at least sometimes, that starts with observations about agent regret. And that, as far as I can see, remains to be done. Williams doesn't give us all we want here. Okay, so that was one argument for moral luck, or one attempted at an argument from agent regret. Here's another one, and that's, or another general strategy, and that's to argue directly against the control condition, at least in its strongest version, or the version that we've been talking about so far. And perhaps the best way to see this is to start with a really strong version of the control condition. So think about a version of the control condition according to which we are only ever morally responsible for things that are absolutely and entirely under our control, for things that are immune to any causal influence except for our own will or intention or actions or something along these lines. This kind of control condition is obviously very strong. It's way too strong. It entails almost immediately that no one's ever responsible for anything, because we live in a network, in a causal network in which our own actions interact with many other things to reach the action, the conclusion, the intention, whatever it is we're supposed to be morally responsible for. So if you're going for that kind of control condition, you are going too far. That control condition is false. And if the problem of moral luck starts with that control condition, then it's a pseudo problem. It's not really a problem at all. No one in the right mind accepts that control condition. You may notice that we are here approaching the general problem of the free will, a problem that people who discuss moral luck try to avoid getting into. Not because it's not important or interesting, but because it's too important and interesting. And the thought is that we are unlikely to make progress if we just keep returning to this very general problem of free will. But if you're going to be using this really strong version of the control condition, that seems to be what you're doing. In the terms that Tom Nagel used and made famous, if we're going for that kind of a control condition, we seem to be shrinking the area of moral responsibility to an extensionless point. Nothing remains. So perhaps that control condition is false. Perhaps, though, the thing to do in response is to strategically retreat to a different version, a weaker version of the control condition. But then we need to understand that control condition, and we need to see whether it takes us all the way to the denial of moral luck. And it's not obvious that it does. So here's one way of fleshing out a sense of control that is consistent with moral luck. So think about the murderer who sees that the attempted murderer gets blamed less or perhaps punished less severely. And then the murderer proceeds to complain, look, true, I shot the gun, I wanted to kill him, but the fact that he died, rather than the fact that it was merely an attempted murder, as in the other person's case, that was not under my control at all. If that's what the murderer says, we are unlikely to take him seriously. In a relevant sense, perhaps not in all relevant senses, but in a relevant sense, if you take a gun and shoot someone with the intention of killing them, the fact that they die is no surprise to you, and it's not a matter of mere luck either. It is entirely under your control. If you didn't want to do it, you could have avoided shooting. Right? So perhaps the intuitions underlying the control condition, the one that we want maintained even after rejecting two strong versions of the control condition, perhaps those intuitions are really quite different. Perhaps they're the ones that this example brings to light. And so perhaps the real powerful intuitions underlying the control condition on moral responsibility are at the end of the day consistent with at least some cases of moral luck. So let's now consider arguments proceeding in the opposite direction, trying to establish the claim that there is no moral luck and perhaps to strengthen the control condition. And here's one very natural thought, and that's the thought that there would be something unfair if we punish the murderer more seriously than the attempted murderer, or even if we blame them more, or if we take the example of the two negligent drivers, if we blame them differentially, given that they were equally negligent. There seems to be something unfair, maybe even arbitrary. One sort of fun way of thinking about it is to return to the example of the two judges, the actually corrupt judge and the potentially corrupt judge, and then to think that the one who actually took a bribe is brought to trial in front of the one who didn't but would have. It's not just weird, it's also problematic, maybe arbitrary or unfair. Anyway, it's certainly hypocritical for the judge who by sheer luck was never offered a bribe but would have taken a bribe had it been offered, to consider him or herself morally superior to the one who took a bribe. So that's, I think, a natural intuition to have, and yet I think that at the end of the day it's mistaken. And the main reason is that we're now talking about morality, not about the law. Morality is not an agent, it's not an institution, it just says what it says. So it's not that the question is not whether morality is going to treat us in a fair way, because morality is not an agent. It's not something that treats us either in a fair way or in an unfair way. This is just a category mistake. It's just a confusion. So I don't think that much remains of this line of argument. Perhaps there's a thought here and that is somewhat more benign, and that's the thought that it's just implausible that morality is sensitive to luck in that way. Now, I fully feel the strength of that intuition, but notice that at this point, it's no longer an argument for moral luck. It's just a restatement sorry, an argument against moral luck. It's just a restatement of the intuition that there is no moral luck. But then we have made no progress. So I don't think that this line of thought is very promising. Here's one that seems to me to be more interesting. And it proceeds by analogy from cases where morality seems to be irrelevant, but we can talk about rationality and about the rational way to make a decision or to proceed. So let's talk about rationality for a second. So assume there are two basketball coaches who need to make, each of them needs to make a call of who gets to make the final shot. Maybe there are like 2 or 3 seconds to the game. It's timeout, and they have to decide who gets the ball for the final shot. Now, they're going to make the decision, and they're going to make the decision, even if they make the right decision, it's just a percentage game. Making the right decision, I take it, amounts to giving the last shot to the person with the highest chances of making it, but they may still fail. Okay, so let's assume that the two coaches make an equally good or an equally bad call, right? But that the consequences differ widely, so that one of the players makes the shot, the other one misses. And now my question is, what do we think in terms of rational evaluation of their decision? Now that we know that one of the players made the shot and one did not. Now we need to distinguish this question from other questions in the vicinity here. So one question is, who will be praised in the media? And we know that, right? The coach who will be praised in the media is the coach whose player made the shot. But that, of course, does not mean that the decision was the right one to make. Right? It could have been a matter of luck. Nor does it mean that the coach whose player actually missed the shot made the wrong call. It's just a percentage game. So that's not the question. And the question, of course, not about whose team won and whose team lost. We know how that's decided. That's not decided directly by the rationality of the decisions of the coaches, but rather by who makes how many shots. So these are different questions, and I just want to set them aside. What I want to focus on is, what do we think about the decisions, about the coaches' decisions in this case? And I want to put forward the following claim, based mostly on its intuitive force. And that's that we ought to assess them alike in terms of rationality. The two coaches in the scenario that I described made an equally good or an equally bad choice at the time. The fact that later on, one of these decisions sort of paid up and the other did not, because one of the players made the shot and the other did not, is neither here nor there when we come to the rational evaluation of the coach's decision. Maybe it should matter to how big a bonus they get. That's a different matter. But as to rational assessment of their decision, it just does not matter. And one way of summing up that conclusion is to say that there is no rational luck. That's a touch too strong, right? Because it's just one case. But it's safer to say that there is no rational luck in consequences, at least not in this case and in cases that are relevantly like it. This was still about rationality. Morality is still not an issue here. But if we plug in some really plausible, controversial, but plausible assumptions about the relations between moral evaluation and rational evaluation, then we get a conclusion about moral luck. If we think that moral evaluation is at the very least closely analogous to rational evaluation, and perhaps even the relations between them are stronger, perhaps moral evaluation entails rational evaluation. If so, then the fact that there is no rational luck in consequences, for instance, in the coach's example, seems to entail that there's no moral luck either. How strong this analogy is will depend on these controversial issues about the relation between morality and rationality, as well as on the intuition that I put forward on the rationality case, namely that there is no rational luck. So these were attempts at arguments sort of directly against moral luck. But now we come to the more common kind of strategy here, and that's the strategy of debunking the pro-moral luck intuitions. So we need to talk a little bit about how you do that in general. People in epistemology and in other parts of normative discourse often distinguish between what's called outweighing defeat and undercutting defeat. So here's one nice example. Suppose there's an eyewitness saying that the butler did it. That gives you some reason to believe that the butler did it. Okay, that was easy enough. Now let's distinguish between two cases. In one case, the butler has an alibi, a fairly strong alibi. Well, that's strong evidence that he did not do it. And if the evidence for the alibi is strong enough, then that evidence outweighs the strength of the eye testimony. What this means is that the eye testimony still has some weight. It still pulls in the direction of finding the butler guilty, but there is stronger weight on the other side. The evidence for the alibi is weightier, and that's why we talk in metaphorical terms of outweighing, right? It's like having some weight on this scale, but more weight on the other. That's one kind of defeating. But there's also another one. Suppose what the defense attorney does in the face of the eye testimony is not to bring positive evidence for an alibi claim, but rather what the defense attorney does is to debunk the eyewitness. Maybe you can show that the eyewitness's eyesight is not as good as it would take to distinguish between the butler and his evil twin. Notice that this kind of evidence does not directly count against the claim that the butler did it. What it does count against is the weight of the eye testimony for the claim that he did do it. This is sometimes called undercutting defeat. It doesn't directly argue in the opposite direction. It takes away the weight or the probative force of the evidence for the claim. When we're talking about debunking intuitions, what we're doing is pretty much that. We are offering debunking explanations or undercutting defeat of the intuitions for moral luck. Anyway, that's going to be the main game here. So one thing you may think is that perhaps the intuitions in the cases of moral luck that we described, perhaps what those intuitions track are not exactly blameworthiness, but something else, maybe evidence for wrongdoing or evidence for blameworthiness that is in fact consistent with there being no moral luck. That seems to be plausible, at least sometimes, right? So think about the two negligent drivers now, and think now in more practical terms. So it's not as if God has whispered in our ears that they were equally negligent. We need evidence to decide how negligent the two drivers were. And at least with some plausible background assumptions, there is a correlation between the tendency to cause harm and the degree of negligence. So the fact that one driver caused harm, maybe killed someone, and the other did not, is at least some evidence that the first driver drove in a way that was more dangerous and perhaps reckless, perhaps more negligent. Notice that here the different consequences do not directly go to differential blameworthiness, but merely to evidence of differential wrongdoing and blameworthiness. But that's consistent with there being no moral luck, right? That's consistent with the moral status itself not depending on factors that lie outside our control. But still something in the vicinity here does. So you see that this is an explanation of the intuition, why you would have that intuition. It tracks evidence of wrongdoing rather than wrongdoing or blameworthiness directly. It's an explanation of the intuition that takes away its weight as a reason to accept moral luck. And I do think it's plausible, at least in some cases, as I mentioned in the two negligent driver cases. But it has to be admitted that it's not always the case. Right? There may be cases in which we have very strong evidence that the two negligent drivers were equally negligent after all. Or maybe in some cases there is no strong correlation between the tendency to cause harm and negligence and blameworthiness. In fact, there may be cases in which we have very strong countervailing evidence. So it may be the case that the driver who harmed the pedestrian actually has a wonderful record in terms of how careful she used to be until now and how very little harm she's done, so far and so on. Whereas the driver who did not hit a pedestrian, maybe we have evidence of a horrible record. If so, then we have some evidence that it's the driver who was lucky this time who drove in a more careless way. In that case, you would expect us to blame more the driver who was more careless, regardless of consequences. And it's not clear that we get that either. So the line, what's sometimes called the evidential line, or the epistemological line, the line according to which the moral luck intuitions really do not track blameworthiness directly, but what they track is evidence. It's not clear that that line, plausible though it is in some cases, actually is wide and strong enough to debunk all of the relevant intuitions. One other strategy that we can use in order to debunk or to attempt to debunk the pro-moral luck intuitions is to rely on finer distinctions. And this is actually a case where some philosophical technique can help. So here's one distinction. you may want to distinguish, in this case and in many others, between differential blameworthiness and the justifiability of differential responses. And this is important because there are some considerations that may be relevant to the justification of differential responses that are just not relevant to differential blameworthiness. We can think of silly, everyday kind of examples. So suppose that you shouted at me, and suppose that you wrongfully did that. So there was no justification for you shouting at me. And now the question is, how should I respond? Now, you are blameworthy, let us assume. You don't have any justification. You don't even have what we sometimes call an excuse, the kind of thing that takes away blameworthiness. Still, it seems to me, if we're friends, you shouted at me, and your day has been going really rough already. That's a very strong reason for me not to respond too aggressively, or perhaps not to respond at all. Notice that the fact that you've been having a hard day now, we're assuming, is not relevant to your blameworthiness. You shouldn't have shouted at me, and it's no excuse. But at least in some cases, it's a good enough reason not to respond, or not to respond in certain ways. So this is the kind of consideration that may be relevant to differential responses, but not to differential blameworthiness. This is important because you may think that some of our intuitions, what they really track, is not differential blameworthiness, say, due to different circumstances or to different consequences. But rather what they indicate is that we should respond differently for all sorts of other considerations other than blameworthiness. If so, their role as intuitions counting for moral luck is debunked, at least to an extent. This is something we'll return to when we talk about the law. The distinction between moral luck and plain luck is also important here. And it's important to note this distinction even in cases where plain luck has morally relevant consequences. So let's talk about this for a while. So even people who reject moral luck accept that many things are subject to luck. Remember, all we mean by luck here is not under your control in the relevant sense. So of course, many things are subject to luck in that sense. And in particular, almost all theories of well-being or of what makes someone's life go better, almost all of these theories agree that how well your life goes may depend on things that are not under your direct control. Whether you or your loved one gets sick may very well not depend on things that are under your control, but it can have strong influence, a strong effect on how well your life is going. So of course, many things depend on luck. That doesn't settle the issue of moral luck. The question about moral luck is whether moral status, blameworthiness, praiseworthiness, can depend on luck in the ways we've been describing, not on whether many important things, including how your life goes, can depend on luck. That's common ground between the two sides of the debate over moral luck. But now it's also important to see that one of the things that are obviously subject to luck is which moral duties apply to you. And that may sound mysterious, but it's not. It's just a function of the fact that morality is sensitive to circumstances in the following way. Whether you are morally required to dip your hand into the pond may depend on the question whether whether a baby is drowning there right now. Right? That's not anything mysterious at all. There's presumably a background general duty to save people if you can at no serious cost or harm to yourself. And then if you happen to go by a pond where a baby is drowning, that general duty kicks in, and now you should do it. And otherwise, the duty remains abstract and does not kick in a similar way. So that's a way in which moral duties you have, which concrete moral duties you have, is at least partly a function of luck. You did not put the baby there, or anyway, so we're assuming and hoping. What this means is that which duties you have will at least partly be a function of luck. But that does not settle the issue about moral luck. Everyone agrees that morality is sensitive to circumstances in this way. The question is whether, given the circumstances, you can be differentially blameworthy or praiseworthy depending on further factors that are not under your control. To the extent that our intuitions in the pro-moral luck cases, to the extent that those intuitions track plain luck and not moral luck, their role as intuitions for moral luck is debunked. Okay, so this should give you a feel for the moral discussion, for the moral philosophy discussion of moral luck. And I think you should get the feel that we're not just stuck with the clashing intuitions with our starting point. There are these argumentative moves that we can pursue and that I described here very, very briefly. Still, you may be concerned that we may not have gone far enough from the clashing intuitions. Now, the problem is not merely that no evidence that we brought so far is conclusive. That's often the case in philosophy, it's often the case everywhere else, and we can just learn to live with that. There's not much choice, it seems. The real problem is different. The real problem is that when we try to assess the strength of the arguments, say of the agent regret argument, or of the explanations debunking or attempting to debunk intuitions for moral luck, when we're trying to assess them for weight or for strength, we seem to be returning to the power of the initial clashing intuitions. If that's the case, you may be worried that we have not yet gone far enough from the starting point. In fact, you may be worried that there is not much progress to be achieved here. Perhaps the discussion of moral luck, as some authors writing about it suggest, perhaps it's just too basic. Perhaps it's not the kind of stuff that can easily be decided by other things. It's the kind of things you have to first decide and then rely on it in order to argue for other conclusions. So there's this worry in the background, and I just want to acknowledge it before we proceed, because we have to related topic, namely the law.